The sound of metal grinding against metal echoed through the basement workshop of a modest two-story house in Detroit, Michigan, mixing with the distant rumble of assembly lines from the Ford Willow Run factory 3 miles away. It was November 1943, and 26-year-old Ruth Brennan sat hunched over a workbench cluttered with disassembled firearms, her hands black with gun oil, her auburn hair tied back with a faded blue bandana. Her eyes focused with an intensity that made the November cold seem irrelevant. Outside, the Detroit winter was beginning its annual assault, frost creeping across windows, wind howling down streets lined with brick houses where women worked in factories and prayed for sons and husbands fighting overseas. But Ruth wasn't praying. Ruth was building. The Thompson submachine gun lay before her in pieces, its distinctive drum magazine sitting to one side, its barrel removed, its firing mechanism exposed like the internal organs of some mechanical beast. This wasn't Ruth's weapon. It belonged to her younger brother, Michael, a sergeant in the 82nd Airborne, who'd been killed 3 months earlier during the invasion of Sicily. The Army had sent his personal effects home in a wooden crate, including this Thompson that he carried through North Africa and into Italy, and along with it came a letter Michael had written 2 days before he died, a letter that had haunted Ruth every single day since she'd read it. Ruthie, he'd written in his cramped handwriting, "This gun saved my life for times, but it also almost got me killed twice. The damn thing jams in dusty conditions. The drum mag is too heavy and throws off your aim when you're moving fast, and the rate of fire burns through ammo, so quick you're empty before you know it. I keep thinking about all those modifications you used to talk about when we go shooting at Uncle Frank's farm, back when you were obsessed with firearms engineering, and everyone thought you were crazy for a girl to care about such things. I wish you were here to fix this beast properly. Maybe after this war is over, you can show all those Army engineers what a real gunsmith looks like. Love you, sis. See you when I get home." But Michael hadn't come home. A German sniper had killed him while he was changing magazines during a firefight in a small Sicilian village whose name Ruth couldn't even pronounce. The official report said he'd been exposed for only 3 seconds, but 3 seconds with an empty weapon was apparently enough. Ruth had read that letter 50 times, 100 times, until she'd memorized every word, every scratch of pen on paper, every implicit accusation that the weapon designed to protect her brother had failed him when he needed it most. The men at the Detroit Ordnance District Office, where she'd worked since 1942 as a technical illustrator, told her she was being emotional, that Michael's death wasn't the gun's fault, that the Thompson was a proven weapon system used by thousands of soldiers, that one man's complaints didn't mean anything needed to change. But Ruth had been around firearms her entire life. Her father, Patrick Brennan, had been a gunsmith before the Depression destroyed his business, and he'd taught both his children everything he knew about how weapons worked, how they failed, and how they could be improved. Michael had gone into the Army. Ruth had tried to become an engineer, but no college in Michigan in 1935 would accept a woman into the mechanical engineering program. So she taught herself, reading every technical manual she could find, taking apart every weapon she could get her hands on, understanding them in ways that most soldiers never would. She'd been sketching modifications to the Thompson for 2 months, working late at night after her shifts at the Ordnance Office, filling notebooks with detailed drawings and calculations. She'd identified 7 specific problems with the weapon. The drum magazine was too heavy and unreliable. The rate of fire was too high and wasted ammunition. The cooling system was inadequate for sustained fire. The sights were poorly designed for rapid target acquisition. The stock was too long for close-quarters combat. The weight distribution was poor, and the weapon had a tendency to jam when exposed to dust or sand. The Army engineers she'd shown her work to had laughed. Some had been polite about it, explaining that weapons design was complex and that she didn't understand the full context. Others had been cruel, asking if she planned to knit little sweaters for the bullets too, suggesting she stick to drawing pretty pictures and leave the real engineering to men who knew what they were doing. I know that our audience is made of intelligent and exigent people like you, so help us to continue producing high-quality content by subscribing to the channel. Your support means these stories of determination and courage continue to be told. So Ruth had stopped asking for permission. She'd started building instead. Using her brother's Thompson as a base, she began implementing her modifications one by one. She replaced the drum magazine with a custom 30-round stick magazine that was lighter and more reliable. She modified the bolt mechanism to reduce the rate of fire from 800 rounds per minute to a more controllable 550, which would make the weapon more accurate and conserve ammunition. She redesigned the barrel shroud to improve heat dissipation. She adjusted the sights for faster target acquisition. She shortened the stock by 2 inches for better handling in confined spaces. She rebalanced the weapon's weight distribution to reduce muzzle climb during automatic fire. And most controversially, she added a quick-change barrel system that would allow a soldier to swap out an overheated barrel in less than 10 seconds, something no other submachine gun in the world could do. The work consumed her. She spent her paycheck on parts and materials, bought tools from pawn shops, traded favors with machinists at the Willow Run factory who'd sneak her access to precision equipment after hours. Her mother, Catherine, worried that Ruth was losing herself to grief, that this obsession with improving her dead brother's weapon was an unhealthy way to process loss. Her father understood better. He'd sit with her sometimes in that basement workshop, handing her tools, offering quiet suggestions, recognizing in his daughter the same passion for mechanical perfection that had driven him before the world had beaten out of him. "You're doing good work, Ruthie," he'd tell her. "Michael will be proud. Hell, I'm proud. You're building something real here, something that matters." By March 1944, Ruth had completed her prototype. The modified Thompson looked different enough from the original that most people wouldn't recognize it as the same weapon. It was sleeker, better balanced, more purposeful somehow. She took it to a private shooting range outside Detroit, a place run by a retired Army sergeant named Walter Hayes, who didn't ask too many questions about where civilians got automatic weapons. She fired 500 rounds through it that day, testing it in every configuration she could think of. The weapon performed flawlessly. The reduced rate of fire made it significantly more accurate. The new magazine system never jammed. The quick-change barrel allowed for sustained fire without overheating. The improved sights made target acquisition nearly instantaneous. Walter Hayes, who'd seen combat in World War I and knew weapons like some men knew baseball statistics, watched her shoot and then said quietly, "Ma'am, that's the finest submachine gun I've ever seen. What are you going to do with it?" Ruth had been thinking about that question for months. The honest answer was that she didn't know. She couldn't sell it to the Army. They'd already made clear they weren't interested in modifications from a civilian woman who drew pictures for a living. She couldn't manufacture it commercially. She didn't have the capital or the connections. She couldn't even talk about it publicly without risking prosecution for weapons modifications that might technically be illegal. So the weapon sat in her basement, a monument to her brother's death and her own frustrated brilliance, a solution to a problem that nobody with power wanted to acknowledge existed. Then in April 1944, everything changed. Ruth received a visit at her home from a man who introduced himself as Captain James Morrison from the Office of Strategic Services. He was in his mid-30s, wearing civilian clothes, with the careful eyes of someone who noticed everything and revealed nothing. "Miss Brennan," he said when she answered the door, "I understand you've been doing some interesting work with firearms. I'd like to talk to you about a job opportunity." Ruth stared at him, confused and suspicious. "How do you know about my work?" she asked. Captain Morrison smiled slightly. "Walter Hayes at the shooting range is one of our informants. He reports on anyone doing unusual weapons development. Usually it's criminals or Nazi sympathizers we're interested in. But sometimes we find someone like you. May I come in?" They sat in her living room while her mother served coffee and tried very hard not to eavesdrop from the kitchen. Captain Morrison explained that the OSS was running operations behind enemy lines throughout occupied Europe. Small teams of agents and commandos who worked with resistance fighters to sabotage German operations, gather intelligence, and cause chaos in the enemy's rear areas. These teams often found themselves in situations where they needed maximum firepower and minimum space, where they needed weapons that could be concealed, carried over long distances, and then used in close-quarters combat with devastating effect. The Thompson was popular with these units, but it had limitations. Exactly the limitations that Michael had written about in his letter, the limitations that Ruth had spent 5 months solving. "We've heard," Captain Morrison said carefully, "that you've built something better. We'd like to see it. And if it's as good as our source suggests, we'd like you to build more of them, not for the regular army. They're too invested in existing systems to change now. But for us, for special operations, where unconventional solutions to unconventional problems are exactly what we need. He paused, studying her face. There's just one catch. We need someone who can not only build these weapons, but who can teach our people how to use them properly, how to maintain them in field conditions, how to maximize their potential. And ideally, someone who could accompany a team into occupied territory to provide direct support. I know that's asking a lot, Miss Brennan, but we're asking because we think you're capable of it. Ruth's mother dropped a coffee cup in the kitchen. The crash of porcelain on linoleum sounded like a gunshot. Ruth sat frozen, her mind racing. He was asking her to go to war. To leave Detroit, leave her family, leave safety, and go to occupied Europe with commandos and spies to fight Germans in a way that regular soldiers didn't fight. It was insane. It was terrifying. It was impossible. And yet, sitting there in her living room with this quiet OSS captain watching her with those careful eyes, Ruth felt something she hadn't felt since reading Michael's letter. Purpose, direction, a way to make his death mean something more than just another name on a casualty list, another gold star in a window, another family destroyed by war. When will I leave? She asked. Captain Morrison's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested approval. Training starts in 2 weeks at a facility in Virginia. Basic combat skills, parachute training, survival techniques, all the things you'd need to operate behind enemy lines. Then you deploy with a team to France, probably in June or July, depending on how the invasion goes. The mission would last anywhere from 2 weeks to 3 months. I won't lie to you, Miss Brennan. It's dangerous. Most of our people make it back, but not all of them. You'd be operating in enemy territory with minimal support. If you're captured, the Germans will execute you as a spy. The Army won't acknowledge your service publicly. Your family will be told you're doing classified work in Washington. No glory, no recognition, just the knowledge that you're doing something that might save American lives and help end this war faster. Ruth thought about Michael bleeding out in a Sicilian street because his weapon had failed him at the critical moment. She thought about all the other soldiers carrying Thompsons with the same flaws, all the other sisters who might receive telegrams because a weapon jammed or ran empty at the wrong time. She thought about the modified Thompson in her basement, the solution she created that nobody wanted to acknowledge. And she thought about what her father had said, "You're building something real here, something that matters." She looked at Captain Morrison and said, "I'll need to bring my prototype and enough parts to build at least 10 more weapons. And I'll need access to a proper machine shop wherever we're going. Can you arrange that?" Captain Morrison smiled, a real smile this time. "Miss Brennan, I think we're going to get along just fine." The next 2 weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. Ruth quit her job at the Ordnance Office, giving them a cover story about transferring to a classified project in Washington. She packed up her tools and materials, created her modified Thompson and boxes of parts, and said goodbye to her parents in a tearful scene at the Detroit train station. Her father hugged her hard and whispered, "Make them see, Ruthie. Make them understand what you've built." Her mother just cried and made her promise to be careful, to write when she could, to come home when it was over. Ruth promised, knowing she might not be able to keep any of those promises, knowing that war didn't care about what you promised your mother. The OSS training facility turned out to be a converted estate in rural Virginia, surrounded by woods and guarded by soldiers who asked no questions. Ruth was the only woman in her training group of 12, and for the first few days, the men treated her with a mixture of skepticism and condescension. That changed during the first live-fire exercise, when Ruth demonstrated her modified Thompson and proceeded to outshoot everyone on a range by a significant margin. The weapon's improved accuracy and controllability made it possible to place rapid-fire bursts with precision that the standard Thompson couldn't match. By the end of the first week, the men were asking her to let them try it, and by the end of the second week, they were asking her to build them their own. She built 8 modified Thompsons over the next 3 weeks, working in a machine shop the OSS had set up specifically for her, training the other operatives on how to use and maintain the weapons properly. She also went to the same training they did, hand-to-hand combat, where she learned that being smaller and underestimated could be an advantage, parachute jumps, where she discovered she wasn't afraid of heights but was terrified of the moment between leaving the plane and feeling the chute open, survival skills, where her childhood experience hunting with her father proved surprisingly relevant, and demolitions, where she found she had an unexpected talent for understanding how things could be blown apart as well as how they could be built. Her instructor for demolitions was a grizzled sergeant named Robert Chen, a Chinese-American from San Francisco who'd been doing covert operations since before the war started. He took particular interest in Ruth's weapons work, and one evening after training, he told her something that stuck with her. Most people, he said, see weapons as tools for killing, and they're that. But they're also tools for survival, for protection, for giving soldiers a chance to come home. What you've built isn't just a better gun. It's a few extra seconds of life for whoever carries it. Don't ever forget that. When things get hard out there, when you see what these weapons do to human bodies, remember that every improvement you made might save an American life. That's what matters. Ruth deployed to France in July 1944, a month after D-Day, parachuting into occupied territory near the town akin with a team of 6 OSS operatives and 3 British commandos. Their mission was to link up with French resistance fighters and conduct sabotage operations against German supply lines and communications infrastructure. Ruth carried her modified Thompson, 60 rounds of ammunition, and a small toolkit for field repairs. She'd never been more terrified in her life. The jump itself was chaos, flak bursting around the transport plane, the night sky lit by distant fires from the invasion beaches, the ground rushing up faster than seemed possible. She landed hard in a farmer's field, twisted her ankle, and spent the first 5 minutes of her combat deployment sitting in French mud, trying not to cry, while her team leader, a tough Boston Irish captain named Sean O'Malley, checked her over and declared her fit to continue. The next 6 weeks were nothing like she'd imagined war would be. There were no grand battles, no clear front lines, just constant movement to the French countryside, hiding in barns and cellars, working with resistance fighters who ranged from brave patriots to opportunistic thugs, conducting small raids against German positions, and then disappearing before reinforcements could arrive. Ruth learned what combat actually meant. Not heroic charges, but ugly, confused violence in the dark, the smell of cordite and blood, the sound of wounded men screaming, the feeling of absolute terror mixed with strange moments of boredom and exhaustion. Her modified Thompson proved its worth again and again in a firefight near a German checkpoint. The weapon's improved accuracy allowed her to take out 2 guards from 50 yards, while the team's other Thompsons struggled with the distance. During a raid on a supply depot, the quick change barrel system meant she could provide sustained covering fire while the team planted demolitions, something that would have been impossible with a standard Thompson that would have overheated and jammed. The other operatives noticed. They started asking for their own modifications. They started calling her weapon Ruth Special, and then just the Special, and then they started calling her Special Ruth, which she hated but accepted because soldiers needed to give each other nicknames. It was part of how they dealt with the stress of possibly dying at any moment. Then came September 1944, and the mission that would define everything else. Allied intelligence had identified a German communications center in a fortified position near the town of Nancy, a complex of 3 reinforced bunkers built into a hillside, connected by trenches, defended by approximately 30 German soldiers. The communications center was coordinating German artillery positions across a 50-mile front, and taking it out would save American lives during the upcoming offensive. A regular assault would require significant forces and would alert the Germans in time to destroy their equipment. What the OSS wanted was a small team raid. Get in fast, destroy the equipment, get out before reinforcement arrived. Captain O'Malley's team drew the assignment. They spent 2 days planning, studying maps and intelligence photos, working out approach routes and timing. The plan was straightforward. Hit the bunkers at dawn when the guards would be tired, use explosives to breach the doors, clear each bunker in sequence, plant charges on communications equipment, and withdraw before German reinforcements from a nearby town could respond. It was risky but doable, assuming everything went according to plan. Ruth had learned enough about combat by then to know that nothing ever went according to plan. They moved into position the night before, crawling through autumn fields where the morning frost made their hands numb and their breath visible in the moonlight. Ruth carried her Thompson, a pack full of ammunition and explosives, and a growing sense that something was wrong. The bunkers sat on the hillside like concrete tumors, their gun slits dark and watching, surrounded by barbed wire and minefields that the resistance had mapped but couldn't guarantee were complete. The team settled into a depression in the ground about 200 yards from the target, and Captain O'Malley gave them the briefing one last time. 4 men would assault Bunker 1. 2 men would provide covering fire. Ruth would stay in reserve with the team's radio operator, ready to provide support if needed or call for extraction if things went bad. Ruth hated it. She hadn't come to France to sit in a hole while other people fought. But she was still the newest member of the team, still the woman in a group of men who'd been doing this longer, still trying to prove she belonged here. So she nodded and checked her weapon and waited for dawn, watching the sky lighten to gray and then to pale blue, watching birds begin to sing as if there wasn't about to be violence and death, watching the German guards change shift at the bunkers, routine and bored, and about to have the worst morning of their lives. The assault started at 6:15, exactly on schedule. The demolition charges blew the door of Bunker 1 with a crack that echoed across the hillside, and O'Malley's team rushed in, weapons firing, and for about 30 seconds everything went perfectly. Then the Germans in Bunkers 2 and 3 opened fire with machine guns, and Ruth watched 2 of her teammates go down in the kill zone between the bunkers, watched O'Malley and the others pinned down behind inadequate cover, watched the whole plan fall apart in real time. The radio operator next to her was screaming into his handset, calling for support, but the nearest Allied units were 20 miles away and wouldn't arrive in time. Ruth saw O'Malley take a round in the shoulder, saw him drop his Thompson, saw the German machine gunner in Bunker 2 adjusting his fire to finish him off. And something inside Ruth, something that had been built from grief and anger and months of preparation, and her brother's last letter, just decided. She grabbed her Thompson, checked the magazine, flipped the selector to automatic, and ran. She covered the 200 yards of the bunkers in what felt like both an eternity and an instant, her feet pounding frozen ground, her breath burning in her lungs, bullets cracking past her head close enough that she could feel their passage. The German machine gunner in Bunker 2 saw her coming and swung his weapon toward her, but Ruth dove into a shell crater 20 yards from his position and came up firing. Her first burst hit the concrete around a gun slit, making him flinch back, and in that second of hesitation, Ruth was up and running again, closing the distance before he could reacquire her. She hit the bunker wall next to the entrance, pulled a grenade from her belt, yanked the pin, counted 2 seconds, and threw it through the doorway. The explosion was muffled by the concrete, but she heard screaming inside, and then she was through the door before the smoke cleared, her Thompson up and firing. The inside of the bunker was chaos. For German soldiers, 1 dead from the grenade, 1 wounded and screaming, 2 scrambling for weapons. Ruth shot them both, short control bursts exactly the way she'd trained, and the improved accuracy of her modified weapon meant the shots went exactly where she aimed them, even in confined space in smoke and terror. Bunker 2 clear. Ruth stepped back outside, saw O'Malley waving at her frantically, pointing toward Bunker 3, where Germans were setting up another machine gun. She ran along the trench connecting the bunkers. Her modified Thompson's reduced rate of fire, meaning she still had ammunition left when she reached the entrance to Bunker 3. 2 German soldiers came around a corner, and she shot them before they could raise their rifles. Another appeared in the doorway of the bunker, and she shot him too. And then she was inside Bunker 3, and there were 6 more Germans, and they were turning toward her with weapons. And Ruth Brennan from Detroit, who'd never wanted to hurt anyone, just wanted to build a better gun to save her brother, except her brother was already dead, she fired. The firefight in Bunker 3 lasted maybe 10 seconds, but felt like forever. Ruth moved through confined space on pure instinct, everything she trained combining with adrenaline and terror into a kind of violent dance. Her modified Thompson performed flawlessly. The improved handling made it possible to maneuver in the tight quarters. The better sights meant she could acquire targets even in the dim light. The quick-change barrel system didn't matter, because she was firing in short bursts that didn't overheat the weapon. She killed 4 Germans and wounded 2 more before they could organize a defense. And then she was out of ammunition and dropping the empty magazine and slamming in a fresh one and realizing that the bunker had gone silent, except for the wounded men groaning. She stood there shaking, her ears ringing from the gunfire in the enclosed space, her throat raw from breathing smoke and cordite, her hands slick with blood from a cut she didn't remember getting. Captain O'Malley appeared in the doorway, his shoulder bandaged, his face white with shock. "Jesus Christ, Ruth," he said. "Jesus Christ. You just cleared 2 bunkers by yourself. 3 if we count the first one that the team took. You just cleared 3 goddamn bunkers by yourself." Ruth looked at her Thompson, at the weapon she'd built in her basement in Detroit, the weapon she designed to save soldiers like her brother, and she started laughing. Not happy laughter, but the kind of laughter that comes when you're too overwhelmed to process what's happening, when you just killed maybe a dozen men, and survived what should have killed you and accomplished what everyone said was impossible. She laughed until she cried, and O'Malley just stood there and let her, because he understood that sometimes that's all you can do. They destroyed the German communications equipment, set charges that would collapse all 3 bunkers, and withdrew before reinforcements arrived. The mission was a complete success. Allied artillery got better coordination for next week, which meant fewer American casualties, which meant Ruth's mission had accomplished exactly what it was supposed to. But Ruth couldn't feel good about it. She'd killed people, not in the abstract, not by guiding bombs like some remote technician, but directly, personally, looking into their faces and pulling the trigger. Some of them had been young, maybe younger than Michael. Some of them might have been conscripts who didn't want to be there any more than she did. It didn't matter that they were Germans. Didn't matter that they would have killed her first given a chance. She'd still taken lives, and no amount of tactical success could change that. The team returned to England for debriefing and medical treatment. Captain O'Malley's shoulder wound required surgery, but wasn't life-threatening. Ruth's ankle, which she'd twisted on the initial jump and then basically ignored for 2 months, turned out to be fractured and required a cast. The OSS doctors also diagnosed her with what they carefully called combat fatigue, which Ruth understood was a polite way of saying she was having nightmares and panic attacks and couldn't stop seeing the faces of the men she killed. They offered to send her home, said she'd done more than enough, said nobody would think less of her for accepting medical discharge. Ruth said no. She'd come here to make her brother's death mean something, to prove that her modifications could save lives, and one mission was enough. So they sent her back to France in November 1944, and she did all over again. More raids, more firefights, more nights hiding in frozen forests and cellars and ruins. Her modified Thompson became something of a legend among OSS operatives in France. Other weapons specialists studied it, tried to understand what she'd done, requested their own modifications. The Army Ordnance Department, the same people who'd laughed at her work in Detroit, sent representatives to interview her about her design changes, and Ruth took savage pleasure in making them admit that maybe, just maybe, a civilian woman with no formal engineering degree had actually improved on their weapon system. She participated in 11 more combat operations between November 1944 and March 1945, when a German artillery barrage caught her team in the open and shrapnel from a shell tore through her left leg. The wound was serious enough to finally end her combat service. They evacuated her to England, then to a hospital in New York, and by the time she was well enough to walk again, the war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered. The camps had been liberated, and millions of soldiers were coming home to a peace they'd paid for with blood and trauma and years of their lives. Ruth returned to Detroit in June 1945, limping off the train to find her parents waiting for her, with tears in their eyes and expressions that suggested they'd never really believed she'd come back. The Army gave her an honorable discharge and a Purple Heart, and a classified commendation for her service with the OSS that she couldn't talk about and nobody could see. The modifications she'd made to the Thompson were eventually incorporated into later submachine gun designs, though the Army never officially credited her work. She'd been proven right, but in a way that would never be publicly acknowledged. Her innovations absorbed into the military-industrial complex without her name attached. She tried to return a normal life, but there was nothing normal about being a combat veteran in 1945 America, especially a female combat veteran whose service was classified and whose experiences couldn't be shared. She'd wake up in the middle of the night, hearing gunfire that wasn't there, seeing faces of German soldiers she'd killed. She'd freeze at loud noises, have panic attacks in crowds, struggle to relate to people who'd never seen combat, and couldn't understand what it had done to her. The doctors called it battle fatigue, shell shock, combat exhaustion. They gave her pills that made her feel numb in therapy that seemed designed for men and didn't know what to do with a woman who'd cleared 3 bunkers alone. Her father tried to help her get back into weapons design, connected her with manufacturers who were retooling for peacetime production. But Ruth couldn't touch firearms anymore without remembering. She tried going back to school, finally able to enroll in engineering programs that had started accepting women, but sitting in classes full of young men who'd never been to war, learning theories about weapon systems that she'd actually use in combat, felt absurd and painful. She tried a dozen different jobs over the next few years. Technical writer, draftsperson, factory supervisor. Nothing fit. She'd become someone specific during the war. Someone capable and dangerous and useful, and peacetime America didn't have a place for that person. She married in 1948, a fellow veteran named Thomas who'd been in the Pacific and understood nightmares and silence. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl, and Ruth tried to be a good mother and a good wife and to forget that she'd once built weapons in a basement and used them to kill people. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes she could go weeks without thinking about bunkers or gunfire or the weight of her modified Thompson in her hands. But it was always there, under the surface, a part of her that had been forged in violence and couldn't be completely smoothed away. In 1963, 18 years after the war ended, Ruth received a phone call from a Department of Defense historian who was researching OSS operations in France. The records had finally been declassified, and her story was there in the files. The civilian weapons designer who joined covert operations, the modified Thompson that had outperformed standard weapons, the solo assault on 3 German bunkers that had saved an entire mission. The historian wanted to interview her, to include her story in an official history, to finally give her credit for what she'd accomplished. Ruth said yes, not because she wanted recognition, but because she wanted people to understand something important. She wanted them to understand that war doesn't care whether you're a man or a woman, civilian or soldier, engineer or fighter. War just finds the people who are willing to do what needs doing and uses them up and spits them out. And if you survive, you carry the weight of what you did for the rest of your life. She wanted people to understand that her modifications to the Thompson hadn't been about glory or proving anyone wrong. They'd been about her brother dying with an empty weapon, about other soldiers who might avoid the same fate, about turning grief into something useful even if it cost her pieces of herself she'd never get back. The interview led to others, and slowly, Ruth's story became known. Veterans organizations invited her to speak. Engineering societies belatedly recognized her contributions to weapons design. In 1975, the Army finally, officially acknowledged that several post-war improvements to submachine guns had been based on modifications originally developed by Ruth Brennan during her OSS service. It was something, even if it came 30 years too late to help her when she needed it. Ruth lived until 1994, dying at age 77 in the same house in Detroit where she'd built her first modified Thompson in the basement 50 years earlier. She'd lived long enough to see women integrate fully into the military, long enough to see combat veterans finally get proper treatment for PTSD, long enough to see her granddaughter graduate from MIT with a degree in mechanical engineering. At her funeral, a group of elderly men who'd served with her in France showed up in their old uniforms and stood honor guard by her casket, and one of them told her family something they'd never known, that every member of their team had survived the war, that statistically that was almost impossible, and that they all believed Ruth's modified weapons had been the difference. The bunkers near Nancy still exist, overgrown with vegetation. Tourist sites now where French children learn about the war and liberation. There's a small plaque that mentions an American commando raid in September 1944, but it doesn't give names or details. Doesn't mention a 26-year-old woman from Detroit who ran 200 yards through machine gun fire because she couldn't stand to watch more people die when she had the skills to stop it. History remembers the big operations, the famous generals, the decisive battles. It forgets the individual moments of courage and innovation and desperate improvisation that actually determine outcomes. But the people who were there remember the operatives Ruth served with, the resistance fighters she worked alongside, the soldiers who later carried weapons incorporating her modifications. They remember that someone named Ruth Brennan decided that accepting limitations was the same as accepting deaths, that if weapons failed soldiers, then weapons needed to be fixed, and that being told you couldn't do something meant nothing if you were willing to prove everyone wrong. They remember that she was called delusional for thinking she could improve a proven weapon system, that she was called crazy for wanting to take her modifications into combat, that she was doubted and dismissed and underestimated right up until the moment she cleared 3 Nazi bunkers alone and proved that courage and skill and innovation don't care about what anyone else thinks is possible. If you're still here, if you stayed with Ruth through every modification and every mission, and every difficult year after the war, then you understand why these stories matter. They show us that history is made by ordinary people who refuse to accept that things can't be better, who look at problems everyone else has given up on and decide to solve them anyway. Ruth Brennan never wanted to be a hero. She just wanted to keep her brother and people like him alive, and when she couldn't save him, she built something that might save others. That's not delusional. That's human, in the best and most painful way possible. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button and let me know in the comments by writing "This message was for me," so I can see that Ruth's courage reached you the way it reached me when I first discovered her story. And if you're ready for another journey into the untold corners of history, another story of someone who changed the world in ways that almost got forgotten, the next video is waiting for you.